Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the Tiny Kingdom demo and why I think could be one of the next big roguelikes to come out. Tiny Kingdom is a card-based roguelike, sort of deck builder game. It's nothing like Slay the Spire, for instance, but essentially you start with a little island, and with this little island you expand by playing cards. You build structures by playing cards, you expand your land by playing cards. So the goal of the game is essentially to make your kingdom less tiny by expanding the borders of your kingdom. It's somewhat grid-based, like you can't see the grid, but it's very much based on like what's the adjacent tiles, because there's a lot of like synergy bonuses to placing buildings down next to each other, and it will grant you like extra synergies. Essentially, the goal for the game is that you keep growing, you keep expanding your kingdom, but you cannot run out of cards in your deck or out of gold. It's not like a game like Slay the Spire where you draft cards and you get a choice of 3 cards or anything like that. But by playing some cards and placing them correctly to achieve synergy bonuses, you essentially end up getting more cards into your deck. So for instance, if I play a wooden house in this game, it will always draw me a card and it will always increase my population by 2. But if I place it down next to another wooden house, it will also add another card to my deck, and this other card will be either a field or lumberyard. So this is a very interesting concept to me in itself, because you don't have that much control over your deck, but at the same time you kind of do, because by putting down these houses in a way, you kind of determine how many extra cards will be put into my deck. When you get a house, you do want to put down these houses because they increase your population, and the population essentially functions kind of like a high score. So when you place down a house early in the game, you will almost always want all the cards you can get in your deck, because you have very few cards in your deck and you will want anything extra you can get. Also, you will be in need of all the other things to get other cards in your deck, to get resources, so on. For instance, fields allow you, when your house can give you a field, and when you get a field essentially gives you 1 gold as a baseline, but then it gives you an additional gold per adjacent field of the same type that you place it nearby. So you want to kind of base them in a grid or in a square so you can get as much gold out of it as possible. But later on, you might not need the gold. I have not encountered not needing gold, but you might not need the gold, or you might not need lumber mills or lumber yards. And because of this, you might, when you put down a house, you still want the population, so you're going to put it down, but you might not want to put it down next to another house, because you might not want these things in your deck, because your deck can become very bloated in the late game. And so you might instead want to space them out. Especially very early on in the game, you're very limited by space, because you start out with this tiny island and like you can hardly fit anything on it. Like you might be able to fit, I don't know, 4 or 6 houses max. And you obviously want to try to keep all these synergies with various things and keeping them together. Like you want to keep fields together, you want to keep houses together. So you need to grow this island, and you can do that, but early on, you don't get very many options to it, whereas later in the game, I started drowning in these island cards you put down. So yeah, early on, there's a lot of space management and trying to figure out also which things are really important to get the bonuses from, and which are you okay with maybe not getting the bonus from. It's very easy to run out of gold, especially in the early game, so you typically want to prioritize that. So this synergy concept for cards is used for almost all the cards I encountered throughout the demo. Another example of this is the lumberyard. The lumberyard is a little bit different because it's not based on you don't want to place it next to another lumberyard, but instead you want to place it next to the natural resources needed for lumberyard, which is trees. So you put down the lumberyard next to trees, and for every tree adjacent to the lumberyard, a wooden house or pier will be added into your deck. So we already know what the wooden houses do, but the piers you can put down out along the edges, out towards the water. That makes sense, kind of. But at the same time, the piers add all these island cards into your deck, and that's super nice, at least early on, because you really want to grow your deck. Later on, it becomes a bit of a hassle with all these piers and all these islands, because at some point, you reach a point where you actually just have enough land. So to expand your island, you play these island cards, and the island cards are quite interesting because they always have a shape on them. You can see the shape before you play the card, and that's the shape you're going to place. So then you place it in almost like Tetris-like manner. So you place it down, you can rotate it, and sometimes also be natural resources on the island, such as trees, such as stone, and they're just there. So you have to place it down, you have to consider these things, because you can't just remove a tree easily. So if you place it in a way where it might block your houses, so you can't place them next to each other or something, then that's not ideal. So to fuel your kingdom's expansion, you need this constant source of cards, both in deck and on hand. And you also need a lot of gold, and you need a lot of space so you can put stuff down. Obviously, some cards like houses, they draw cards for you, but it's not very many cards that draw cards for you. So you need a lot of gold, because every time you want to draw a card, you can always draw a card if there's cards in your deck. assuming you have hand space, and you do this by just clicking on your deck. It will withdraw 1 gold from your bank and you'll draw a card. If you run out of gold, if you run out of space, or if you run out of cards in your deck, you're done. You lose the round and it's just start over. This is a like full-on roguelike, at least in the demo. There's no meta progression mechanics or anything like that. So the game essentially ends up becoming this balancing act between maintaining your gold and your deck and your hand, and keeping enough space on land as well, and placing stuff correctly, and thinking about where you want to place stuff for like maximum synergies. Do you want to pad out your deck or do you want to thin it down? You basically have to be thinking about these things all the time. On top of everything else I've mentioned, there's also a further synergy system for some cards, such as houses, such as fields. For instance, with fields, if you place 4 fields together, they will form into a complete field, essentially. This is important both because the mills need complete fields, but we're not going to go into that now, but also they're going to give you additional cards to your deck. I think the cards they add are cards with remove, which you can essentially just play and remove any structure, any tree, any stone, whatever you want on the map. So they're pretty powerful cards. Obviously they don't do anything for your gold or for your deck, but they allow you potentially to very quickly get a new synergy bonus by just removing that last house in the synergy combination and then adding in a new house, and boom, you have a full synergy again. So they're very powerful cards, or they can just remove that pesky tree that's in the way. But yeah, as we talked about, population is very important because that's essentially the high score of the game. But there's also all these thresholds that unlock new cards for you. At some point you start unlocking stone houses instead of just wooden houses, and these do something different, but they increase your population by 4 instead of 2 from the wooden houses. On top of that, when you reach a population of 100, you're gonna get your first stronghold card. This card will be shuffled into your deck like all the others, and your goal is obviously to draw this card. When you place it down, construction of a stronghold will begin, but it will need another, I think, an additional 4 stronghold cards to actually complete this construction of the strongholds. So it's pretty interesting with this because you want to keep your deck very thin to draw this stronghold card. It should be mentioned that you get the subsequent stronghold cards from reaching higher population thresholds. And so in the late game you enter into this really difficult, in my opinion, balancing act of trying to keep your deck thin but also get the cards in there you want. And it becomes especially difficult because you have no way to discard cards, at least not one that I found. And so sometimes you're forced to play cards that you don't really want to play. Especially peers can be very problematic in my experience because they add, I believe, 5 island cards. There's at least a lot of cards these peers add. So playing a single peer becomes actually this big issue in terms of your deck becomes really bloated. I think in the end of my run I had over 100 cards in deck and maybe 3 or 4 stronghold cards still left in the deck, and I just never drew them. And I had so much land in the end that I didn't really need all this land for anything, and I just kept getting islands, and the islands do nothing for me when I don't actually need the space because they don't offer me any gold, they don't offer me any new cards in deck. Granted, I did not want any more new cards in deck unless they were like really good cards with a lot of draw or something like that. So I would have really liked a way to discard these cards, but I understand that the game design is not designed in that way, and it's very possibly just a case of I need to get better at the game to better understand when I should stop actually playing these cards or when I should stop playing lumber mills so I don't end up with all these peers. I really like the art style of the game. It's a very cute, very simple art style. It's a very simple presentation too, very easy to understand at least what's going on as a baseline in the game. The soundtrack of the game was also quite relaxing, so I also like that. Not too much to say there. There's a few things I think could be improved. I would like more player agency, as I said. I would really like the option to discard cards from hand in some capacity, even if it comes with a cost, because it ended up being an issue. I think it could be cool to just have a gold cost attached to discarding. The massive deck size in the endgame, it was a problem for me. It would probably be a lot better if I understood the game better. Okay, and I have one major complaint that I really think should be changed. Okay, so it's very frustrating when you're placing down cards, like island cards, that you can't tell at a glance, is there woods on the cards, is there stone, is there any resources, or is it just a blank island? Because I have to sit and click 4 or 5 cards to see, okay, does any of these have the type of resource I'm looking for? And then I need to try to remember it if I don't place them down. So I would really like that change. I think it should be a relatively simple change to just update the UI in hand with showing that there's resource on the islands. I would like more chances to curate my deck as well. Obviously the way you influence it is by placing down things and thinking way more strategically, but maybe a little more influence on what card I get when I get a synergy bonus, because a lot of the time it is just you get either this, this, or this. And if 2 of the things is something you don't want, but you really want the 3rd thing, that obviously becomes, it is a trade-off and it is what it is, but sometimes it just feels pretty bad because sometimes you need to do it. But I guess that's part of the philosophy with the game, so it probably shouldn't be changed, but it was just something like, it was something that was a hassle for me or something that bothered me. So for the full release of the game, I would like to see some new card types that offer you that player agency, that choice. You get to choose which of these 3 cards you want to add to your deck, or to your hand for that matter. It's not for all the cards or anything. I think it's great that there are some more, like some tough choices to be made, but I'd also like more fun choices to make. So I think that would help a lot alleviate the way it feels bad to just always have to make bad choices, or feel like you're missing out on something to make the correct choice. So I have one more complaint, and this complaint is not about the actual gameplay per se, but it is more so about the atmosphere of the game, because I really liked the atmosphere. It was very relaxing playing the game. I enjoyed it quite a bit. It was fun, but I found it very frustrating with especially placing down piers, that I would like my island to be aesthetically pleasing, and my island was just not aesthetically pleasing because of all these piers I was placing down. Because the piers, in my opinion, start looking really ugly when you place a lot of them, and you kind of have no control over where you place them, because you just need to place them out towards the water, and that means there's just a bunch of piers sticking out in different directions. And I don't really know how to fix this, but I would very much like to see this updated in some fashion, because it just bothered me. And it's not just with piers. I would also like a bit more influence on the general layout of my city instead of only having to cluster houses. I understand that for gameplay reasons you do need to cluster them, but could maybe dial it back a little bit on this, a little more flexibility with some of the structures. Okay, so generally I think, I actually think this game is really cool in concept. Initially I was gonna say I think it needs a lot of work, because it felt very frustrating for me in the end with this bloated deck, and it just felt like I had no agency. But the more I've thought about the game, the more I actually think I have a lot of agency. I just need to not always take these synergy bonuses. I need to think about, okay, if I play this card, I might get this card, and this card I don't want to play, so maybe I shouldn't be playing this card, or I should be placing it so I don't get these synergy bonuses. So I think the more you play this, actually possibly a lot of depth to it, but I don't think it's going to be something like Slay the Spire or Balatro where it just blows up, but I think it has a lot of potential still, and I think this is one to keep your eye on. So thank you so much for watching, and have a very nice day.